Well, welcome everybody. We're so happy you've joined us today to learn about the direction of dyslexia and social emotional well-being. I'm Melissa Lazaro with Lexplore, and if you're not familiar with Lexplore, we're a 3-minute reading assessment that uses AI and eye tracking to determine a child's reading ability. And with the power of eye tracking, you can now receive a student's silent reading ability, which is absolutely fantastic. As leaders in the science of reading, we offer a lot of free tools and training and reading videos. And this is just one of those free services that we offer to you is a webinar. And I'm really excited about today's topic and our guest speaker, Shantell Barrett-Blake. But before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. We've muted participants for clear audio. You can go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. We're not responding to raised hands, and we've disabled the chat so that we can quickly respond to you during the webinar and Q&A, and we'll save some questions for the end as well that we'll do in a live Q&A. We will send you a link to the webinar recording, and so you'll have access to that to be able to share it with your colleagues. And if there's any other questions that you might have, again, just put those in the Q&A. So good morning, Shantell. Welcome. I'd like to share a little bit about your background information before we get going this morning. Shantell is a dyslexia expert, and she's also leads the professional development team at Reading Horizons, and she's been there about 11 years. And she and I share a passion for teaching all students how to learn how to read, and a lot of that comes from just our personal experience of raising a son with dyslexia and dysgraphia. And so she brings a personal passion to her career, and we'll share that with you today. She has a long list of postgraduate certifications that I'm sure you read about in her bio, and one of those is a reading science concentration and dyslexia certification. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shantell Barrett-Blake for our topic today, covering the direction of dyslexia and social emotional well-being.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks for having me today. You are very right that I am incredibly passionate about this subject. I'm excited to be here with you all today and share this information. If you do have questions, like Melissa mentioned, put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end, and we want to be able to answer those for you, and we can answer after this as well. So 3 main objectives that I want to cover today. I want to talk about, we're talking about the direction of dyslexia. I want to talk a little bit about where we're starting from. We've definitely made gains in where we're starting from now, and talking a little bit about those dyslexia laws and where we're at this point. And then get in specifically, because a lot of those laws are helping us to identify dyslexia earlier, to get remediation for students, and talk a little bit about those supports that are needed for individuals with dyslexia. And then I want to end with where we're going, addressing the whole individual, which is where we're getting into the social and emotional needs of these individuals, which is something now that the focus is really starting to move towards, and thankfully so, because really we are whole individuals, and unless we address all of those pieces, we don't see that full remediation or access for full potential a lot of times for students. So I'm excited about where we're at now and where we're headed, and that's the direction that I want to walk you through today. So let's talk about where we're starting from, what those dyslexia laws and resources are currently. So this is the most recent map of the United States of where dyslexia laws are enacted, where some are pending, if you've got a handbook or a resource guide, and you can look at that and kind of see where you're at. It is important to note that if your state doesn't have a specific law yet, that still with the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, it does recognize dyslexia now. There's actually 13 conditions that are identified in one specific thing called specific learning disability. Dyslexia is one of those. So those 13 conditions would qualify a student for special ed. What's interesting about individuals with dyslexia, though, we'll talk about, is their other skills are so high that a lot of times they can compensate in a way that they don't get identified to get the help that they need, that these laws are trying to make sure happens. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. That was an issue I ran into with my son some, but my younger daughter as well, who was a compensator and didn't show up with issues until about junior high. So the dyslexia laws came into place to be able to make sure that that each state has the ability to really support and implement those federal laws and add to it. They can't take away, they can't do less than what the basic laws are from a federal standpoint, but they're allowing states to implement that in whatever way they want and provide more. And that's where there's different branches that I'm going to talk about, different organizations that are helping make sure that there's more there, because honestly, it's not super specific from the the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. It's fairly general, and so we needed to get a little more specific. They don't really define dyslexia. They talk about it as just kind of a general issue and that it should be recognized, but it doesn't really even talk about how to address it. So the individual dyslexia laws that are coming into the states are to help do some of these things that are lacking. First, define dyslexia, and a lot are pulling from the International Dyslexia Association, their most recent definition, which I'll talk a little bit about. The focus of those individual state dyslexia laws are to provide early screening and identification, because we know from the research that the earlier we can catch that, the more that we can, ensure that that remediation happens early and that students experience. It's not that it's ever too late, but when they can continue to struggle and experience repeated failure, then a lot of times that's where that social and emotional comes in, and that can be a real roadblock to even those positive aspects of remediation from a reading end. When you've got those beliefs and those other difficulties into play, then that can be problematic. And so that's another reason why that early screening and identification is important. The laws within the states are also setting out procedures for schools on that screening and intervention. Those are tied to dyslexia handbooks. So you can look if your state has a specific dyslexia handbook, and anyone can access those to get those details. The focus for the dyslexia laws is also on training and professional development for in-service teachers. That's another critical thing, to make sure that teachers are more aware of what dyslexia is and how to identify it, and then how to remediate once that's been identified. And we're making sure that education for pre-service teachers is happening. And actually, the International Dyslexia Association is the one that is pioneering that, where they specifically are working with making sure that that is part of a requirement, a semester-long class for pre-service teachers, those that are going into education, to make sure that they have that training before they ever even enter a classroom. And then the accommodations and support for early intervention for students identified as having dyslexia. Those are things that we're working. Emily asked, who do we contact in our state to get that handbook? That you can look at a couple different places. International Dyslexia Association will have the link. That's the easiest place. You can look at just your education department at the state level. If you look at that area, you can get it there as well. But I usually go through IDA, so that's what I'm most familiar with, because they'll make those connections of where you can find those as well. And we'll share some of those links after. So the International Dyslexia Association, like I said, is really the best place, as it's a lot of what's driving the law, that and Decoding Dyslexia, which I'll talk about. So the International Dyslexia Association is a nonprofit dyslexia education and advocacy organization with over 9,000 members and 40 branches. So a lot of states are getting their own branches of that to help influence those state laws as well. And there's also 21 global partners. They provide fantastic information online at their website, and their peer-reviewed scientific journal, Annals of Dyslexia, is fantastic as well. So it's coming slowly, but the states are starting to adopt their own branch, get their own branch to be able to help extend the reach of IDA and make sure that this is happening and influencing those laws at a state level. One of the greatest things IDA, International Dyslexia Association, has put out is their knowledge and practice standards for educators, where it's a very detailed document looking at the specific elements that need to be addressed and how those need to be addressed. And when we're talking back about pre-service teachers, this is one of the things that was required in my graduate work, that my program had to meet all of these standards, and I had to take a test to pass those knowledge and standards as well. And that's something they're trying to push for even the undergrad, to make sure that teachers, we just didn't always get that knowledge base going in to the classroom. And so this is one of the things that IDEA is really pushing to make sure that that happens. So again, from a federal level, it's more general. It's falling under that specific learning disability, where now the individual state laws are trying to make sure that there's even more happening, defining dyslexia, getting this education to teachers, holding teachers to these standards so that we can better support our students. Those are all things that are happening right now. It's made some amazing gains even in the 13 plus years that I've been involved in this specifically. To see those gains is hopeful. We've come a long way from where we were, where some were still really unsure of what dyslexia was, and specifically schools were not even willing to identify it. For a lot of reasons, for legal reasons. And so now with those in place, we're able to do that more effectively for students. One of the things that actually has helped move a lot of the laws at state levels is Decoding Dyslexia. And this is a parent-led grassroots movement aimed at raising dyslexia awareness in schools, empowering families to support their students, and informing policymakers on how to remediate and support students with dyslexia. So this is a lot of parent organized, just some serious power behind this, where we've had a lot of gains happen. This is actually because we, for example, I'm here in Utah and we're just creating the branch, our branch of International Dyslexia Association. So it's taking states a while, but Decoding Dyslexia has been here quite a while now. And one of the reasons we have a handbook is because of Decoding Dyslexia. So this is a great resource to look at. You can find if your state has Decoding Dyslexia in the state specifically. You can just look up Decoding Dyslexia and it'll tell you. International Dyslexia Association will tell you if they've got a branch in your state. And then Decoding Dyslexia you can look at on their website to see. Again, there's a lot of great resources for parents, but also for teachers with Decoding Dyslexia. So those are just some main, I'm not going to go into this too specifically because I want to spend more time today on how to address these needs for the individual students with dyslexia. But these are some things just to be aware of, that there's definitely movement in making sure that students have what they need. And it's coming both from the International Dyslexia Association and this grassroots movements of Decoding Dyslexia to make sure that these things are in place for our students. So let's dive into how to identify dyslexia and what supports are needed. So to identify dyslexia, first we have to know what it is. And again, that's one of the purposes of those state laws, is to define it. And a lot are pulling from this definition of International Dyslexia Association, which they have stated that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. So it is highly hereditary. So you're going to see if you've got, for example, my uncle was diagnosed, my father is undiagnosed, but has every characteristic in the book. So this has come from that side of my family for when my son was identified with dyslexia, and his younger sister who has a milder form. She was a compensator. It took longer to be identified, but you will often see siblings that have it, parents that have it. And so that is an important thing to be aware of. In fact, when we're looking at diagnosing, that's one of the things that we do is take a family history, just like you would when you go in for a medical condition. That family history is part of that. It's going to give us that information there. It's characterized by difficulties in a specific aspect of language, specifically when we're talking about the reading process, tied to those foundational skills of word recognition and spelling and decoding, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Those difficulties typically result from a deficit in a specific area, and they are, what's interesting is that they are unexpected, considering other strengths, and a lot of times even with some good instruction. And so they need a very, very specific type of instruction. Okay, sorry, I'm just double checking questions to make sure I'm not missing anything that's timely while I'm right here. Okay, yeah, so yes, happening in the United States for sure. International Dyslexia Association does have global partners Decoding Dyslexia is only within the United States, but International Dyslexia Association is a great place for you to start to look at what is happening there for your area. So specifically, International Dyslexia Association also has been one that has brought the research to what's happening within the brain with reading, and specifically where those areas have been identified as those specific deficits. So actually our brain is wired for speaking, but not for reading. Reading is a construct that basically what we say has to be bolted on. Specific areas of the brain that are designed for speech in the left hemisphere that also in the visual cortex analyze the visual input part to whole. Most will be able to, when we work with that instruction, create those connections that allow us to connect the sounds that we're hearing to those symbols and putting those together to be able to recognize those in words and create automaticity at those levels. But not everyone is wired for those pathways to even begin, or those pathways are inefficient. So that's actually what was determined a while ago with Dr. Sally and Bennett Shaywitz in a study that they did at Yale University. They had 61 individuals that they took. 29 had been pre-diagnosed as having dyslexia. And they did a functioning MRI looking at the brain and what areas were firing during that process, everything from letter to sound association all the way to comprehension. And what they identified is, and this is very simple, there's definitely more connections and areas lighting up, but these are the main areas that light up in the typical reader, where we've got the verbal vocabulary up in Broca's area in the frontal cortex, back here in the visuospatial cortex. Then we're looking at those areas that are being able to analyze those parts and pieces and recognize those and mapping those letters and sounds together as well. So those that were not identified, these are the areas that lit up, but those that were identified had a very different result when they were doing those same tasks, where back in the visual cortex, nothing was firing. They were compensating with other pathways in the right hemisphere, which actually processes information very differently. It processes from a whole to part and spatial perspective, as opposed to that part to whole and sequential perspective, which is why we see a lot of the behaviors that we do as far as the approach to reading with individuals with dyslexia. And they actually overuse Broca's area, the part of the brain that was designed for speech, trying to make that connection, which is why they can eventually get there. Sometimes it's just more laborious and they have to essentially take the bumpy back roads instead of the freeway to get to where they want to go. So when we're talking about the science of reading, which is this vast body of evidence from across multiple disciplines over decades, it's looking at what really is happening within the reading process, and thus informing what we need to do for reading instruction and remediation. And what was proposed clear back in 1986, one of the most valuable models that came out of all this research, is the simple view of reading. It really gave us a testable hypothesis to determine what was happening in the reading process, and helps us know what to assess and where the issues lie for individuals with difficulties like those with dyslexia. So Goff and Tumner in 1986 proposed that reading comprehension, which was our goal, is a product of these two main components, decoding and language comprehension. Now there's sub-skills involved in both of these, but these are the main components involved here. And this was coming out in the time when whole language was definitely in its heyday, the approach of a lot of whole word memorization, and if we just exposed students to print, that they would become readers. The evidence later on showed that is not the case. Again, because those connections have to be made in the language centers, and it's dependent upon the instruction that we're providing for our students. While some will somewhat get it regardless of instruction, there's many, especially those individuals with dyslexia, that is all dependent upon the type of instruction, because the area that is of difficulty for them is very specific in this reading formula, that it's tied to the decoding skill involved in reading comprehension. And it's important to note that it's a product, not a sum. One does not compensate for the other. So even if their language comprehension is high, if their decoding is low, that's going to affect their reading comprehension until that is whole on its own. What was really great about the simple view of reading when Goff and Tumner proposed this is they also were able to identify 3 of the main types of reading difficulties based on that formula. And a 4th has since been added, which Kilpatrick talks about. So let's talk about this just briefly to see where those individuals with dyslexia fall and other issues tied to reading difficulties. So they take the simple view of reading, those main components involved, language comprehension across the top, and word reading on the side. So our typical reader are going to be strong in both. Our individuals with dyslexia, again, it's very specific. Their language comprehension is actually strong. Their weakness is specifically in word reading and that decoding aspect as well. The compensator is that 4th subtype that was added later, where their language comprehension is so high that they can actually compensate the weakness in word reading and tell a lot of times the amount that needs to be read, the content level that's expected, usually junior high, high school level. They can mask it until then, and then it will show up later. Now, the mixed reading difficulty, they have a weakness in both, but a lot of times students who have a long time weakness in decoding, that's going to affect the amount that they're reading, thus that's going to affect their level of vocabulary, plus their ability to build background knowledge. And so we see that start to affect comprehension, that language comprehension specifically. So we can see that come over, but a mixed reading has both. Hyperlexic is the least common, where they're a lot of times referred to as word callers, where their decoding is actually strong. Their specific weakness is just in that language comprehension. What stood out to me is this, that out of those 4 main types of reading difficulties, that 3 of those 4 down here, the weakness is in the word reading, or that's part of the weakness there. And so it's so important that we're aware of that in education and as parents, that those are the areas that we need to focus on in instruction and remediation. Individuals with dyslexia are very specific in that word reading area. Now, dyslexia can also coexist with a few other things. So dyslexia can coexist with ADD and ADHD. That's actually what my son was diagnosed with first. And so that's an interesting thing to recognize and be aware of, because a lot of times we'll see that connection. In fact, Dr. Sally Shaywitz has been doing research at Yale by combining protocol for ADD with remediation for individuals with dyslexia to see the results that we're getting there. Dysgraphia is another thing that can be coexisting with dyslexia. It's impacting written expression specifically. So my son also has dysgraphia, specifically the visuospatial sketchpad with orthographic mapping. There's very specific parts that are difficult for him. So even fine motor. So his letters would float, change sizes. He didn't have any sense of spacing when he would write. He couldn't take notes from the board because of that just so many things that were happening there with that visuospatial sketchpad. Just a lot of issues for taking notes and written expression, and that can be comorbid with dyslexia as well. Dyscalculia is impacting numbers. So if they also struggle with numbers, then that can be an aspect that's happening there. And then executive functioning. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It's really the management system of our brain. It's where we're going into planning, organizing. Memory is a subset of that, and reasoning. And so individuals with dyslexia very often, in fact, Virginia Berninger talks about this, it's part of the diagnosis, or should be, because we see that as so prevalent. And then speech and language difficulties as well. Those are all things that dyslexia can and very often coexist with. So just as a quick summary before we talk about how to identify dyslexia and what they need, and then we'll get into that social emotional piece, just to summarize very quickly what dyslexia is. It's a specific learning disability. It's neurobiological in origin, and it's characterized by specific difficulties in word recognition, decoding, and spelling that I'll talk a little bit more about. And because of those, there can be secondary consequences with difficulties in comprehension, lack of vocabulary, and background knowledge as well. But those are just, you know, the details, the specifics of what you're looking at, but really, how does it affect individuals personally? Because there's a lot more going on there. And a few years ago, so my son, who was identified between first and second grade, he's actually 22 now. When he was 17, we actually brought him into the office, and they wanted to just ask him some questions about what his personal experience was like with it. I had no idea what his responses were going to be. And I'm going to share a couple of those clips with you today to let him speak about what this experience is really like to have it.
Dyslexia, what it is to me is that I just have a hard time reading and writing, and then trying to take notes and understand and process what my teachers say. Like sometimes I have a hard time saying it, so sometimes they think it's like made up or something. And so they think I just make an excuse for not being good at English or like writing, just my writing's really bad, or my just reading and grammar and stuff. And they think I just make up an excuse, and it's not an excuse, and it's really something wrong with me. Sometimes when we're taking notes in class, it feels like we're like out catching butterflies, and it takes me forever just to catch one butterfly, and then the whole other class have caught like 3 butterflies, and I have to hurry up and catch up and take my time to catch 2 other butterflies, and it's just hard because it took me forever to get the first one. And like when colleges look at my grades, I always feel bad, like I'm not gonna get into a good college because of my grade in English, no matter how hard I try. I try to bring it up, but it's so hard to do it, and most teachers don't help me try to bring it up. I just get made fun of a lot because of it, because most people think it's just that I'm like stupid or something, but I'm not, and I just have a hard time with it. I just struggle in it.
I was pretty impressed with his butterfly analogy. He comes up with some pretty great analogies, that big picture thinker, and getting that vision. I was blown away by that really was what that was like for him and for others that I have worked with, that, you know, it takes them so long to do one thing where everybody else is so far ahead, and that leads to that constant frustration, that leads to those emotional issues that we're going to talk about. So it's difficult for him because we know that in the traditional school setting, everything is assessed through the language, through reading and writing, and it's not tied to intelligence at all. That's a critical piece that we'll talk briefly about. Super intelligent, they know their stuff. It's the ability to show that and access it because of those difficulties specific to language. So it's important for us to identify that as early as we can, although it's never too late, but grateful for those laws that are making sure, and those organizations that are helping make sure that that happens for individuals. So how do we identify it? First of all, to understand the statistics, that it's about 1 in 5 that are affected with dyslexia, but they're finding that about 1 in every 20 are identified. So we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that those individuals are identified so that we can provide that remediation for them. So the majority of those with dyslexia have average or above average intelligence, and no correlation between dyslexia and IQ has been shown to exist. So again, it can compensate, it takes a while, sometimes that's just missed entirely. So it's really important that we're aware of what we need to be looking for, and is doing that screening early for students to be able to identify that. So common characteristics of dyslexia to look for. So the main one, family history of reading and learning difficulties. So that is tied into that genetic component. Difficulty with phonemic awareness, so identifying or producing accurate consonant and vowel sounds, and difficulty with rapid automatic naming, so the recall of known letters and sounds, that's called RAM. So those are the main characteristics, and these are the 3 main areas that we should be assessing. So phonological awareness, I'll talk about briefly next. It's involving the ability to identify those individual sounds within words, just an overall awareness of sound, and then getting to phonemic awareness, where it's more those individual sounds that students need to be able to identify. Because of the way language was needs to be bolted on. The awareness of sound has to be there first for it to even have something to anchor to. And so that's why this has to be the foundation. And individuals with dyslexia have an issue with that, which becomes that whole kind of catalyst for those issues as they work and begin that reading process. So phonological awareness, again, is that awareness of sound. Looking at early phonological awareness, rhyming, alliteration, the blending, segmenting, deleting, substituting. Can they do that? If you say, what is cat without k? Can they say at? I remember one student I was assessing, and I asked that very question. I said, what is cat without k? And he said, dog. You know, he had no idea what I was asking, because big picture, right brain thinker, sees that, you know, as that whole concept. I take away that individual phoneme, which I can't even recognize. I have no idea what you're asking me, lady. So that recognition of the awareness of those words are made out of individual sounds, so that we can then take those graphemes, those letters, and map that on and understand then those patterns that are permissible within the English language. So this is the first place we want to start assessing, is phonological awareness. Kilpatrick, that I've mentioned a few times, has a free online assessment for phonological awareness. and Reading Rockets does as well. And these are links that we can share after. And those are ones that would be great to, and they're free to be able to access. And if you have any questions, to start with that assessment for those individuals. Now, because of the specific word recognition, decoding, and spelling issues, these are areas that we want to look at. So they are slow. They can get to the word, but they are slow at that automatic recognition. A lot of that is tied to the access of those language centers, but also the RAN. And a lot of that is connected. Decoding, the ability to read unfamiliar words. That's a really, really difficult aspect for individuals with dyslexia. And spelling. It's usually the most severe weakness among students with dyslexia and the most difficult to remedy, especially if dysgraphia is coexisting with that. So there's a lot of issues for individuals here in these main areas. So word recognition, decoding, and spelling, which is why the instruction needs to be very specific to those areas. So you can look at dyslexia screeners are available. We at Reading Horizons actually have a free dyslexia screener, and we can share this link as well. It's confidential, no names. There's 4 versions specific to ages. Each item contains the research support. So you'll see the research connected to each item that's involved in that screener. It includes essential information to gain from parents. So there is an element of that information as far as that family history, which is part of that, and you get immediate results. So how many indicators do you need for their testing? So that's another link that we can share that will look at those specific areas. It's a non-diagnostic because it's considered a medical diagnosis, but you can screen to look for those characteristics and see if you want to get more testing for you or for a loved one or for a student or you know, whatever you want to have that basic sense to then give recommendations moving forward. So rapid automatic naming, that's the other area that we need to assess. It should be part of assessments. And a lot of those dyslexia laws that are coming into place, which is great, tied to that screening is getting very specific from International Dyslexia Association, making sure that these are areas that are being assessed in our schools now for students as well. So this is that rapid automatic naming where we're looking at the ability to identify and name colors and numbers, and that is affecting that word level reading, particularly that automaticity that we're looking at. So that's another area we need to assess. So now if we get that information and we find that there's some issues there, some red flags, then what instruction and supports are needed? So again, to go back to that simple view of reading, the area of difficulty is very specific in that skill of decoding. What research has shown is that there's a very specific type of instruction that needs to happen for remediation in those specific foundational reading skills. Structured literacy is the approach. So structured literacy is teaching systematically and explicitly these skills necessary. And while they'll benefit most students, they are vital for individuals with dyslexia. So structured literacy really encompasses evidence-based programs and approaches aligned to the science of reading that are explicitly teaching word identification and decoding strategies focused on specific elements, utilizing principles based in evidence as well. So International Dyslexia Association is actually who coined the term structured literacy, although it's based on evidence that's been around for multiple decades. And they've also created this image that helps really draw attention to what we should be teaching and how we should be teaching it. So the inner circle are the elements, what we should be teaching. The outer circle are the principles that guide how we're providing that instruction. So we should be covering phonology, sound symbol association, syllables, morphology, syntax, and semantics. We should be providing that instruction explicitly using a systematic approach that's cumulative, each concept building upon the prior, and diagnostic, that we're using consistent informal and formal assessment to gather that data and drive our daily instruction with these individuals. So just to cover these briefly for a couple of minutes, is talking about these elements that are vital for individuals with dyslexia. So again, because of that phonological awareness and phonemic awareness issue, we need to start with that, the awareness of sound, and making sure that they know those 42 to 44 sounds that are produced in the English language, and have multiple opportunities to be able to practice hearing those, pronouncing those, comparing pronunciation. So any approach that you're using should be addressing that as well. And then move into sound symbol association and syllable instruction, but not before that phonological and phonemic awareness are sound. But this is a reciprocal relationship. You can keep reinforcing and building that throughout this phonics instruction, which is focused on sound symbol association and syllable instruction. So Reading Horizons, we are a structured literacy framework. also based on Orton Gillingham for individuals with dyslexia, and very systematically building through those skills that are critical. So when you're looking for an approach, make sure that it's structured literacy. That's the thing that you're looking for, and look for how systematic they are, how simple, because of the working memory issue that I'm going to talk about, and that there's a multi-sensory piece involved that will help connect those language centers in the brain for students. Vocabulary is something that has to be addressed very explicitly with individuals with dyslexia. That's part of structured literacy, is the semantics, and that is part of that word recognition triangle that was identified by Seidenberg, later by Erie, and then Louisa Moats uses it in her letters training, is this aspect of connecting meaning at the same time we're connecting the phonology and orthography of words, and always transferring to context and understanding its use in context. All of that needs to happen simultaneously. Encoding is another key piece, that spelling, which we identified as those issues that we need to be looking for, because sound symbol association must be taught and mastered in both directions. So visual to auditory and auditory to visual. So making sure that spelling is addressed. For example, you know, both C and K make the same sound. They say k. So how do we know to use C and not K? Rules like K takes the vowels I and E, and C takes the other three, A, O, and U. When explicitly taught, become incredibly empowering for these individuals to understand the code of English, where it's not as complex as we think. That although there's a level of complexity to the English language, it doesn't have to be taught in a complex way. In fact, simple, especially for individuals with dyslexia, is better and most effective. So using familiar frameworks, using spatial processes to prove pronunciation, using consistent frameworks like simple 5 skills that are going to support executive function and working memory. Those are all things to watch. Is it overly complex in the instruction? It should be simple, using spatial processes and supports for executive function and working memory. Because then when you've got frameworks that are reused to help support that memory, then for example, teaching morphology, which is part of semantics, can be anchored to skills that they already know to inform that spelling, so that then that makes it easier for them to grasp those concepts, for example, like morphology, that's a key part of that. So let's talk about executive functions. That's the management system of the brain, basically the CEO, and it has a few areas that it covers, quite a few actually. So attention, initiative, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, that's a big one that we talk about. Organization, time management, working memory, and emotional control. A lot of times now we're understanding more of that emotional piece that I'm going to get into. A lot of times it was just assumed that maybe they were emotionally immature, but we're going to talk about specifically what's happening with these individuals with dyslexia. But for example, my son's planning and organization, disastrous. And part of the diagnosis of ADD is an executive function deficiency. And so that's why you see that comorbidity, where you see those coexist with ADD or ADHD and dyslexia, because the main tie there is that executive function issue. So we can see that specific to attention, initiative, inhibition. And so our instruction needs to be able to support this as well for individuals with dyslexia. The 3 main areas of executive function, so that I know it can get easy to be overwhelmed by that list. So let's just break it down to the 3 main areas. So working memory, so know that their memory is going to be an issue, that working memory in particular, and then moving into that short-term memory. So it's common to feel like, oh, they've got it. And then 2 days later, oh, they lost it. And that can be problematic. And so we'll talk a bit more about that. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift perspectives and thinking, that can be an issue for individuals with dyslexia. And inhibitory control, so emotional regulation. Some of that is, again, you'll see that with the individuals. It was so powerful for me when I came across the aspect of executive function, because when my son was first diagnosed, how many years ago now? Man, like 15 years ago or so, executive function wasn't even talked about. So all these other behaviors that I was seeing, the suspicion of ADD, but his the emotional regulation, his inability to be flexible in his thinking, the memory, like none of that was explained to me. And so knowing that helps explain a lot of the behavior that we see and don't always understand, which can create those emotional repercussions and their issues socially, because they don't have that inhibition control. They don't have those things that can affect what's happening in their social relationships as well. Working memory is a big one. In fact, it's been reported that approximately 70% of students with learning disabilities in reading score very low in working memory assessment. So that's something that we need to be looking at too. and understanding how to address that in our instruction and in support of our students and our children and those that we're working with. So strategies to support working memory. So there's three main areas that I'll just hit briefly. Compensatory strategies. So make sure, one of the things that research has shown is that our instruction, whatever it is explicit and step-by-step. So remember the working memory issue. For example, I would say to my son, hey, Tyler, I need you to go to your room and I need you to make your bed and pick up your toys and hang up your clothes. And I'd get deer in headlights. And I'd list it again. And sometimes he would just go upstairs and I'd go up and nothing would be done and I'd find him playing with his Legos. Or, he'd start to break down and get emotional because he couldn't remember. That sequential working memory was an issue. He couldn't remember that list of steps and what I needed him to do, especially if I was just doing it verbally and I didn't give him a visual. So one-step directions, one at a time. Have them provide scaffolded support, like giving them a visual or that one step, and then have them feed that back. So recall strategies. Okay, so I want you to go upstairs and make your bed. Tyler, what do I want you to do? Go upstairs and make your bed. Okay, so go up and make your bed and then I'll come check on you. And just breaking that up and then giving them that next step. So that was really helpful for me, just even managing our household structure and what was happening there. So again, provide explicit instruction in whatever that is, and provide support where they need it. Visual is a huge help. So some of those external aids like visual cues, they really need that, prompts to help recall that. And then do some recall strategies for them if they're saying it back, or again, those external aids that can help with that recall as well. Part of why we need a structure for them is because of the inability to not know how to move through that because of the executive function, but also that's going to make those connections. So when we're talking about a systematic approach, one of the sound instructional approaches is the gradual release of responsibility, something that should be used in education and even at home, that, if we're teaching something new, we want to review that prior information to make sure that they're proficient there, to build on that, then gradually release that with guided practice where we're still supporting them, and then transferring to that independent practice of any task. But we're talking specific reading, this is critical because structured literacy being cumulative, we're building on those prior skills. So you always start with a review more as an informal, formal assessment to see if you can move on to that explicit instruction of the new skill, then giving that guided practice where that multi-sensory sensory piece can come in, and then giving them a lot of opportunity to transfer 5 minutes, even just briefly, but then additional time for reading and writing activities as well. So research validated elements of successful reading intervention programs were identified as having three main components: that they corrected phonological awareness, that they provided phonic decoding instruction, and they provided ample opportunities to apply these to connected text. So that transfer is critical. Individuals with dyslexia have to take those skills that they're learning and reading specifically and transfer it, have lots of opportunity to transfer. This is a fantastic book. I'm going to share three main books at the end as resources, but The Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties by Kilpatrick is invaluable for helping these individuals. So executive function in the classroom, just a few last things. Make sure that as far as planning organization, post schedules, be consistent in routines. Provide organization supports and break down big projects. For instructions and assignments, give step-by-step instructions. Use attention-getting phrases. Have students repeat things back orally. Provide outlines and opportunities for different options for response. I know, for example, my son in one class, he was given, they had to do a book report every month, but he had multiple options to do that, from having a guest speaker to creating a movie, and that just became invaluable to him to share what he knew without just having it have to be a written report. And self-management, they're going to need help to develop that cognitive flexibility by asking prompt questions like, is there another way to look at this? And then giving them support on emotional regulation, which we're going to get into next. So my son talked a little bit about how as teachers we can help in the classroom and addressing executive function and a few of those things as well. So I'll let him share that with you, and then we'll get into specifically those emotional aspects.
What I wish my teachers knew about dyslexia is that I need more time on things and I need more breaks so I can process it, and just to let me, like, instead of having a deadline for everything and like the next day, sometimes I need more time than that to like comprehend what it means and try to understand it fully and then finish it, make sure it's good. Because most of the times I feel rushed by my like homework, and that it that I just like, I feel like I do a crappy job because I don't have enough time to understand what I did. Because it helps me like to move and to process stuff better, and some teachers get mad at me for moving. It kind of makes me mad because that's how I pay attention and that's how I get stuff done. It keeps my brain like flowing and I can just like process it better. It's like a river. If it's not flowing, it can't really take anything. So if I get it flowing, then it can actually start taking stuff, and then it'll start like making more sense and stuff. The things that have helped me that teachers have done is when I was in 5th grade, I had this teacher named Mr. Zimmerman, and he helped me a lot when it was about essays and stuff. Like, he would give me more time and give me a lot of like corrections and what, like why this was wrong and whatnot, and that helped me out. Something that's helped me is that one of my teachers, when we were in class, we do a PowerPoint and then like we take notes from the PowerPoint. And so sometimes I try to focus, and sometimes I only get a little bit of notes, and she hurries up and goes to the next slide. Sometimes I'll miss like a couple of sentences or something. And she puts the PowerPoints online, so I can always go back and look at them and understand it, and then write it down and like get all the notes I needed.
So another really cool analogy I thought he came up with, he needs to move like a river to keep that moving, to take that information with him. He does, and you can see it even in the video. He needs to move a lot. That's tied to the ADD for him as well. But that helps him, and he needs more time. They all need more time. You think about the speed of that processing speed is slower. And so to be able to give them that time, because they can get there, they just need more of that time. And as they get those specific instruction that helps speed up that word recognition time for them, that becomes invaluable as well. So let's talk about now where we're going and addressing the whole individual. So this is a big focus now. I'm going to talk about a couple specific places that are really kind of leading the research in addressing the entire individual, which means we're taking a whole brain approach, that we recognize that this is not just the only issue is specific in the language. Because the whole brain, the networks are in balance with each other, that's going to bring up a few things I'm going to talk about specifically. And to look at their strengths in connection with that, big picture thinkers, spatial knowledge. Oh man, my son can build Legos like nobody's business, and he can see, he's actually a programmer now. He sees how something's going to work, and then he can break it down from there. So he starts that whole and then goes to that part. Social interactions, understanding that that's going to be affected because of that executive function, and getting them the support and tools that they need to know how to handle their emotions because of this key factor. So one of the biggest studies that are coming out of University of California, San Francisco, specifically Virginia Sturm, associate professor there of neurology, they're identifying this. So the brain systems are actually asymmetric, so they're not equal. So what that means is that's identified as paradoxical functional facilitation. So when one area is functioning low, the other area then that's connected is functioning high. So interestingly enough, because the language center is in the left hemisphere, and for individuals with dyslexia, it is functioning low, what they're identifying as research is the emotional brain, that right side, is actually over functioning. It's functioning high. And so we see a lot of increased emotions, really intense emotions. And because of the executive function, they lack the ability to regulate those. So individuals with dyslexia are actually very prone to anxiety and to depression. And so we have to be mindful of that with them. And thankfully, a lot of the research is coming out now about that. They also handle stress not as efficiently because of that. And so what happens, one of my favorite researchers, she's actually a strategic risk expert, Grace LeConte, talks about our response to fear or to stress. We know that fight or flight, we hear about that all the time. Freeze is actually something that happens when we feel like we have no control, or we can't fight or flight, or we can't face it or deal with it, combat it, or run away. Individuals with dyslexia, you can see in the classroom, they're the ones that will either get really aggressive and defensive. That's them fighting during a task involving reading or areas of difficulty for them when their stress is increased, or they'll be the one to take the bathroom pass. Let me get out of the classroom. I don't want to be in here. When they lack the ability to do either of those, or when that stress is repeated over and over again, they'll go to that third response where they freeze and they just completely shut down. And we see students and individuals do that a lot, where they just don't engage at all anymore because it feels hopeless. They develop learned helplessness when this happens over and over again. Grace LeConte talks about a fourth response to fear, which is facing it. Facing our stress, facing those difficult emotions only happens if we have tools to do so. That's a critical factor. So the only way we can face the reading task in front of us if we have tools, which is why structured literacy is so important. I can only handle the stress if I have tools to do that. So part of what we're looking at for individuals with dyslexia, and some dyslexia laws in some states are starting to implement that the social and emotional piece be addressed. Thank heavens, because without this, with that stress being constant, it's missing this big piece, even if we're providing great reading remediation, right? So this is a critical factor in that. What happens when they experience failure over and over again and an increased stress because they're facing, I mean, we know how stressful it is to face something that we don't feel good at, that we personalize and feel like we're broken or it's our fault. And we have to face that day after day. That just increases the stress. And then you tie that into that aspect of the emotional part being higher, then we have these intense emotions, and we can develop what we call learned helplessness, where it's behavior typical when they've got that repeated painful stimuli, where it's where they go into freeze, where we just shut down, where we become we talk about really when we tell our story or describe life in general, we have two main ways, either an optimistic explanatory style or a pessimistic explanatory style. So optimistic is more, hey, life is happening for me and this is okay and I'm going to get through this. And pessimistic is, there's nothing I can do about this. Everything's terrible. And really that was expanded upon by Martin Seligman, a well-known psychologist, who really said how we handle stress and how we handle life is based on these, what he calls the 3 Ps of pessimism: personalization, pervasiveness, and permanence. So if we personalize it and make it, it's my fault. I am broken. I can't fix this. Rather than, hey, you know what? I have dyslexia. This is something I'm experiencing. It's not who I am. And which means it's possible for me to work with, and it just creates this level of separation. When we personalize it too much, then we can't seem to step away from it to do something about it. And pervasiveness, every aspect of my life is affected. Everything is terrible, right? I can't do anything. So they may struggle with just this one aspect of reading, but they make it pervasive. I'm terrible at everything. And that becomes really problematic. And then permanence, that it's always going to be like this. That goes into that fixed mindset. I can't do anything about this. I can't change it. And so they find with individuals who or develop that learned helplessness, this is where we function from. It's the way we process difficulties, and this becomes really a difficult aspect for students. The past is always there's always in the present and always predicting the future. So it's, I've experienced failure before. I'm always going to experience failure. It's because of something that is wrong with me, and I'm terrible at everything. So you can see how that style, they get into just that shutdown mode. And so this is where individuals with dyslexia, and honestly, all of us, benefit by recognizing really what the truth is there, and that we can change that explanatory style. We can get tools to face that stress in front of us and have a different experience. One of the things that they found in research, especially with academic achievement, is that belief in ourselves is more closely linked to that than any other motivation throughout school. So if they start to believe that I'm dumb or I'm not capable or I can't change this, then no matter what we do or what we teach, it's just ineffective. So one of the biggest things we have to do is start to bridge that belief, to help them start to change that belief from, maybe they can't go right away to the extreme belief, because our brain will kind of push against that of, I'm amazing and I can do everything and reading's easy. Well, that's not true. So our brain isn't going to buy that. It's about bridging that to, I have some difficulty in a very specific part of reading, but I'm really intelligent and good at lots of things. And we know with research that we can learn and make those connections and be more effective. And so when they can start to change that belief, they can change their explanatory style. One of the things that I want to share with you at the end of this really quickly, and this is an article that we can share with you, is actually done, it was posted on International Dyslexia Association's website by Dr. Jerome Schultz, who's a clinical neuropsychologist and lecturer on psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard, where he talked about how we can move from distress to de-stress. And he uses de-stress as an acronym about what we need to do to help individuals move and de-stress when they're dealing with this. So first of all, for D, that stands for define. So they need to understand what dyslexia is and how it presents in them. Educate, how is that impacting their performance in school? So really understanding and unpacking that, how is this affecting their ability to handle things? And then look ahead and anticipate challenges. That's what the S stands for, is speculate. So looking ahead, how can I handle this? Start to develop those tools for those roadblocks and challenges. And then the T, teach developmentally appropriate strategies and techniques. So that goes back to our instruction in all aspects, from the reading end to how to handle emotions, reduce the threat, create learning and social environments that reduce, remove, or neutralize the risk. Exercise is one of the things that they need to help reduce stress. So even any movement like my son talked about, anything like that that can help reduce that stress for them, we need to allow. And the last two S's in the de-stress word, success. They need multiple opportunities to experience success from mastery of skills. And that's part of what structured literacy can do. And when they get tools in emotional regulation as well. And then strategize with them about how they can manage their stress and be successful, so that they can go from a language of self-doubt or that pessimistic explanatory style to a language of success. One of the key ways they do that is by developing a growth mindset. Carol Dweck talks a lot about that, where a fixed mindset, it's about validating themselves. That's what they have to focus on. And effort is a bad thing. And if you don't have to work at it, then that means you're good at it. So we hide our struggles and challenges. If it doesn't come easy, don't do it. That becomes very fixed. Because they struggle, then they just give up, and not understanding that, effort plus ability does equal success, that growth means we can develop ourselves and develop our abilities, that challenges are an opportunity to grow, and that we can handle it. When we've got those tools, we can face it. So one of the things we want to do is create that growth mindset with individuals with dyslexia. So first, the way we do that is to acknowledge that fixed mindsets exist, raise awareness about mindsets and how to switch that. Normalize struggles, talk about it. If you're struggling with something, share that and say, it's okay that I'm struggling. I can work at it and get better. Give them time to work through things. That growth takes time, but also to process. Set a culture that values taking risks, and it's okay to fail. It's how we learn. Teach individuals to articulate their thinking, encourage deliberately, encourage the effort, not just the outcome. Encourage that effort and harness the power of yet. I'm not good at reading yet. I'm not good at baking bread yet. Whatever it is, harness the power of yet, and that will develop and help encourage that growth mindset. One of the things, before I let Tyler just share a last thought with it of what we should know tied into that, is one of the things that they've shown best to help with emotional regulation is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the approach to start to analyze our thoughts. And I'm actually working with Medjugorje Health Institute. I am a certified cognitive behavioral therapy practitioner as well. It's something that I recently went into because of this connection. It is invaluable. So if you're looking at ways to help emotions, look at cognitive behavioral therapy, and I can share resources too tied to Medjugorje Health Institute, where you can get tools and resources to help process those thoughts and emotions. But really, when they understand what's happening, when they know who they are, what they're capable of, that makes everything more possible to them. And that's really what we want them to know most of all. So this is what Tyler wants us to know too, and then we'll close out to questions.
The best thing about dyslexia is that with the 5 senses, when you're missing one, it heightens other ones. So since I'm missing kind of my English kind of section of my brain, it heightens other stuff like science and math. And I do excel in those classes, and I just love those classes. And I just love doing scientific things like inventing stuff, programming stuff. What I would tell someone else with dyslexia is that they're not stupid and they can do it. And you just gotta think of your own way to take in information and stuff. And sometimes maybe my stuff will help them, maybe not. Maybe their stuff will help me, maybe not. But just that they're for sure not stupid. They're actually probably smarter than some kids in some subjects. Everyone's smarter than someone in a different way.
I love that. Everyone's smarter than someone in a different way. We all have our strengths, and accessing those is a critical part of helping remediate and providing tools, both in reading and the emotional aspect, because of the executive function and because of what we know is happening in the brain as we address the whole individual, is how we help students face what's in front of them and be successful. So to be mindful and thinking back about where we started, knowing what laws are in place and what's coming, and that we're headed in a great direction, to know more about getting early screening and support, and those laws are even starting to bring in that social and emotional piece. Again, there's resources out there to provide tools for that. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a main one. Dialectical behavior therapy is an aspect of that that can be helpful as well. And those are all resources to look at and support. Specifically for dyslexia research and the science of reading, these are 3 great books that I recommend. Mark Seidenberg's, Kilpatrick's, and Shaywitz. Those are great ones to look at. This is actually the one I started with when I was trying to begin that journey with my son about how to help him. That Overcoming Dyslexia is a great one to start with. So we'll open it up for questions. I will answer additional questions if I can't get to today. You can email me. I also answer questions and post information on all of this on Twitter. You can find me at Reading Shantell if you're on Twitter. And then, of course, the contact information for Melissa. Thank you again for having me, and Lexplorer. And then Lane, who is your contact for Reading Horizons as well. So we'll open up for questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Melissa.
Okay. I think that we've got, I don't think we have any questions right now. I think everything's been answered. So I just want to thank you so much, Shantell, for sharing all this. Is so much information. This is obviously one of those webinars that we should probably watch again and again to glean all of the helpful tips and research that you've shared with us. And so I would encourage all of you in the audience to do that today. And I think the power of everything that you've said is, while these students with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia might suffer social and emotionally from just the impact of their disability, there are ways that we can mitigate this. And one of those ways that we can start is with early identification. And so I don't know if you saw in the Q&A audience, but we did post the link to the Reading Horizons screener. You can find that on their website. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more diagnostic, that just is a step beyond that. Okay, where is the student struggling? How do I compare out loud versus silent reading? Lexplorer would be the solution for that, but that does come with a cost, but it is a 3 to 5 minute assessment as well. So I just thank you so much, Shantell, for bringing awareness to how far we've come in this awareness of dyslexia and the research that is out there. And I know for myself, I was, once your child gets diagnosed and you're in the later years of life, you think, gosh, I wish I would have done things a little bit different. Had I known that my son not following my 3-step instructions wasn't disobedience, it was really that he just couldn't process more than 1 step. And just those little incremental things that we can do as parents and educators to help support these students and encourage them to feel successful is so important. So thank you for sharing that. Early identification and the proper remediation, which Reading Horizons has wonderful tools there for you, and I encourage everybody to check out. Thanks again for joining us, Shantell and Lane. And please follow us on Facebook and all forms of social media, as well as refer to our website for all of our free tools and resources that both Reading Horizons and Lexplorer has for you. Anything else, Shantell?
No, just thank you. And I know a few of you asked for those links and books again, and we'll make sure that we share those with Melissa to share out in the follow-up so that you have access to all of those.
Yeah, so we'll be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar, and Shantell will pass along those resources, and I'll include that in the email that will go out to all of our attendees. So thanks again, and we're all in this together. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.